The onagers begin bombarding the city. At their distance, most of the projectiles crash into the south end of the outer circle, though they have just enough range to pepper the outer walls. The relatively small projectiles don't have the power to devastate the thick walls, but they splinter off pieces of the wooden wall and create a dangerous situation for any men on the south wall. A nuisance, essentially, but given enough time they will slowly, but surely, weaken the walls and the two southern gates. Terbionsen sends a small force to move into position directly north of the docks, led by Halvar the Peacekeeper and Jorg the Spearbreaker. He sends Olaf to prepare a larger force of men to assault the docks from the south. Unferth and Cyril are attached to the southern force, but given the position of irregulars. Cyril is to move in and implement whatever strategy he believes will allow them to drive the enemy force out of the canals, and Unferth, along with his Bearsarks, are to support Cyril and enact his plans. Steelshod has been given several hundred troops, a mix of Serpentes, militia, and some of the knights and yeomen from the outlying fiefs and kingdoms that came when Nahash called for aid. Hundreds of troops, but they are still going to be heavily outnumbered. Fortunately, the canals and Ignis's barricades will force the engagement along relatively narrow paths, negating many of the advantages of superior numbers. Also, Yorin and Alexander are approached by an old acquaintance, Brother Luke, the Serpentis knight that went through the encounter with the Thaumatai with them. He has been sequestered away for a number of days, making his reports to the Serpentes higher-ups and the council. Now, when he approaches Steelshod, he is not clad in a Serpentis tabard. Instead, he just wears simple, woolen clothes under a coat of mail. He tells them that he has left the Serpentes. The Fellowship doesn't seem to take their encounter with the Thaumatai seriously, or plan to do anything about it. He has done some soul-searching and realized that he no longer has much faith in the organization of the church, but he wants to have faith in Toroth again. The faith that Yorin and Elena and Alexander clearly demonstrated when Toroth's light protected them and empowered them. As far as he can tell, Steelshod is the only force that has an interest in stopping true, deep evil wherever it may be, rather than the political struggles that dominate much of the church and the Serpentes. So, he has a request of them. Will they take him on? Of course they will. He was brave and helpful in the underpass, and he can fight well enough. Welcome aboard, Luke. Official induction duel to be done when they aren't facing down a Svardic siege. Back at the Svardic camp, the attackers prepare their tools. Cyril preps a large number of oleander spiked bales, just like they used at Tinian. Unferth and his Bearsarks plan to drive forward and place them in the canal district, especially cutting the canals off from the river gate and trapping Steelshod in a haze of toxic smoke. They set out into the outer circle, using the buildings of the city for cover from the archers on the walls. Olaf directs a large force of Svards and Kriegars, and they begin moving up through the city, intending to hit the south side of the canals on every available front. They coordinate their assault via Ulfsknar howls, and the northern forces begin moving south at the same time. Of course, Drengi is staying at Alexander's side to relay howl translations. Hubert stays close to Yorin to do the same. And poor crippled Hrodir is set up in the high ballista tower, above the keep in the inner circle, with Jaspar and Varley thus giving the master strategist real-time updates as to the enemy troop movements. The day the enemy realize Steelshod have suborned Ulfsknar and the Howls are compromised will be a sad day indeed. Here is a quick sketch of the force arrangements. The battle is joined a few hours before noon, fighting occurs on many fronts. Alexander and the heaviest corps of the defense set up along the southern hardpoints, facing off against Olaf's men outnumbered 5-1, but they hold their ground. In the north, the Svardic force is much smaller, and suffers some pain from archers on the walls, but morale amongst the defenders starts faltering when they see a large contingent of over a dozen Bearsarks start emerging from the midst of the battle lines. The defenders call for more support as the Bearsarks surge towards them. Yorin rushes to their aid. Most of Steelshod's archers are either set up along the outer wall, or on the canal watchtowers, or on high rooftops amidst the cityscape near the docks. The defenders don't spot Unferth and his team until they are deep in the city, maneuvering behind Alexander's lines, cutting him off from the river gate. They call an alarm and begin peppering Unferth and his Berserks with arrows. Ben is in his element on the wall, hammering the Berserks with arrow after arrow after arrow. In his kill zone, he can potentially lay down as many as 3, 4, or even, rarely, 5 arrows in a single round, and each one hits almost as hard as a Berserk. But Unferth's shield and defensive talents keep him largely unscathed, and he continues directing his men into laying down the poisonous bales. Serpente's defenders rush to intercept, but Unferth and his men start shredding through them with ferocity. That's when Felix gets into position above them. His first arrow catches Unferth unawares, piercing through his armor and inflicting noticeable damage. There's a tense couple of exchanges where Unferth manages to deflect or avoid Felix's next few shots. They push in deeper and begin lighting some of the bales. But in our world, much like the real one, all it takes for a tide to turn is a single moment. Felix shifts his sniping spot, getting a new angle on Unferth. He lets fly with a perfectly aimed shot. It blows through Unferth's armor and puts him within a hair's breadth of dropping entirely, piercing deep in his shoulder. Unferth has to withdraw, but between this and the hurt that's being laid down on his men, his entire force breaks with him. They throw down and light the remaining bales, giving no thought to Cyril's carefully planned placement. This backfires massively. As the toxic smoke starts to coalesce along the edge of the battle lines, drifting closer to where Alexander and Olaf's forces are engaged, Alexander sounds a partial retreat, and they manage to use the toxic smoke cloud to their advantage, essentially creating another barrier that funnels the Svards into an even smaller battlefront. Seeing an opportunity, Alexander actually begins taking his forces on the offensive. He rallies the hardened elites of Steelshod's mounted corps, the Serpentes, and even some of the half-trained militia under Perrin's command, and leads them in a series of ferocious charges under the cry of Ooryah! The battle cry is, to my knowledge, just a battle cry. No linguistic significance, just the sound Alexander ends up shouting as they charge the much larger force, and then charge again, and again. But this is the situation in which battle cries are born. Outnumbered, outclassed, and by all rights they should be on the defensive. But with Alexander's indomitable leadership and the prowess of the Steelshod lieutenants, they crash into the Svards again and again, and it is the Svards that finally break. Alexander will gain a bonus here, simply called Ooryah, a free special maneuver that he can lead, a simple, brutal, effective charge. Olaf is able to reassert control of his men, but they have been stalled outside the docks, at least for the moment. Alexander has no time to enjoy the small victory, however. He can see Terbionsen himself leading a group of reinforcements to join Olaf's men. Felix sees it too, and he repositions himself to a forward sniper's perch, trying to get a good line of sight on the Jarl. On the north side, Yorin joins the defenders just as the Berserks arrive. The defenders are mostly militia, with just a few of Steelshod's heavy foot to support them. The sight of some 20 or more Berserks charging down on them is terrifying to say the least, but Yorin darts out ahead of the battle lines and lobs a well-placed thunderbolt right into the Berserk front line. The explosion is a potent one, and it sends the nearest Berserk flying back into a grotesquely crumpled pile of broken bones, scorched flesh, and liquefied innards. The shockwave flattens another half-dozen Berserks, the entire front line, not killing them, but putting them on the ground in a stunned and disorganized pile. Yorin then leads the few Steelshod militia beasts, Zelda, Bear, Miles, Leona, into a charge. The staggered Berserks are slaughtered in a callous and brutal fashion, and Steelshod tears forward into the next line of surprised Berserks. The rank and file of the defenders are greatly inspired by this. The Berserks are not so tough after all. They charge in behind Steelshod. Conversely, Jorg's Svardic troops feel precisely the opposite. The Berserks were supposed to be shock troops, shattering the enemy front lines. Instead, they went out like bitches. Back to the south, Terbionsen and his reinforcements begin advancing. Seeking his moment, Felix takes a shot at Terbionsen. A well-rolled attack, high penetration, high damage. Terbionsen takes it on one of his broad-armored shoulders, shrugs it off like it's nothing. Full disclosure, I didn't want Terbionsen to die like a chump to ranged fire. As a white bear berserk and apparent chosen of Ter himself, a 12-foot-tall monstrosity of a man, I elected to give him a few special anti-archery powers. Taken on the side, gave him bonus protection, damage reduction, versus ranged. But the real kicker was pinpricks, which, okay, I don't remember the original version super well. I think it basically put a hard cap on damage from ranged, like, he just didn't take more than X, 10 maybe, damage from a single ranged shot. So you can see some democratic DMing in action there. Bayard just about flipped a table when I explained the mechanic at the table. I tend towards heavy disclosure of mechanics to my players, unless I think a major purpose is served by secrecy. He felt this was basically a tier just designed to render Felix largely irrelevant, and super unfair. And of course, he was right. It was kinda, and it was poorly designed. A negation of Felix's whole shtick of single hits that hurt. So, we redesigned it into a still very overpowered mechanic that bypassed our normal mechanics, but less bullshit. Pinpricks, instead, was a secondary damage reduction ability. For ranged attacks, after resolving protection and penetration, all remaining damage that gets through protection gets reduced by an extra amount, 1d6 reduction per 10 damage incoming, still making him highly Felix resistant, and Ben resistant, and Prudence resistant, but that was the point. Their paltry arrows are like pinpricks to a man like Terbionsen. So, Felix shoots him. Terbionsen doesn't even flinch. Felix shoots him again, still no visible fucks given, though in reality Terbionsen is certainly feeling these hits, dropping by maybe as much as a quarter of his total HP. Alexander isn't about to lose the docks after all they've done. Terbionsen is moving in ahead of his men, so Alexander gives a cry of Ooryah, charges in on Dasha, flanked by Leon and Anatoly. He pops Terrible Swift Sword on the charge, smashes into Terbionsen with a noticeable hit. Terbionsen grunts, and then scissors in with his sword and axe. Not going for Alexander primarily, but for his mount. There is no doubt in Alexander's mind. Dasha cannot withstand Terbionsen's full fury. So he wheels his horse to the side, and the blow intended to take off Dasha's head instead connects with Alexander's plate-encased arm. The damage is massive, leaving Alexander hovering close to zero and nearly breaking his arm. Echoes of Kilchester, when Alexander and Terbionsen trade blows, it doesn't take more than a brief exchange for them to both be feeling seriously hurt. Anatoly and Leon lay into Terbionsen as well, and rather than tangle with them, he lets himself be driven back. Alexander, likewise, withdraws behind the front lines as more cavalry ride in to support him. Both commanders retreat as their forces continue clashing in the city streets around the canals. But in the north, Jorg and Halvar are forced to sound a retreat as their forces crumple in the wake of the Berserks being slaughtered. When the north breaks, Olaf sees the writing on the wall. He calls a general retreat, and the Svards fall back under missile fire. They hold the docks for another day. The cost was not small. Many militia, and a few Serpentes lie dead. Alexander is not the only member of Steelshod heavily wounded, but they were victorious. Meanwhile, Unferth and Terbionsen are receiving medical attention from Kasseline medicos. As Berserks, they heal supernaturally quickly, but the additional treatment still accelerates their process. Terbionsen's restless rage is growing. He directs his armies to continue probing the defenses of the docks, a relentless pressure, not unlike what he applied to the breach at Kilchester. They keep this up for a few days, but he does not give the order for another all-out assault. Cyril is curious about this. Why are they not pressing harder? Sakapos and Terbionsen clearly have more tricks up their sleeve, but he can't figure out what. Meanwhile, Yorin leads his stealth team out of the city to do what they do best, a night raid. They're annoyed to find the enemy camp locked down tight. The Casseline legions maintain an aggressively well-organized perimeter, with redundant sentry patrols, staked trenches, the whole 9 yards. Not wanting to tip their hand just yet, Yorin calls the raid a bust. For now. But they observe the patrols for several hours each night for the next couple of nights, even writing down their observations so that they can analyze the patterns and try to identify any weaknesses. After 3 days of this, Terbionsen orders a heavy assault, not on the docks, but on the western wall far from the docks. Sakapos directs a large portion of troops, especially the Lorinet cavalry, to assemble near the docks as if they plan to assault. But it's a distraction. The real assault hits the gates while the defenders are too busy splitting their forces. At least, in theory. But when you factor in some of Varley's tiers, such as Foresight and No Plan Survives, it should come as no surprise that Varley can read and counter Sakapos' strategies just as well as Sakapos has done to his. The assault on the gates is met with heavy Serpentes resistance. Steelshod can't help much, in case Sakapos turns around and really does order an attack on the docks, so the fighting is brutal, fierce, and only loosely witnessed by any PCs, as Jaspar lays down heavy ballista fire upon the enemy troops. The Serpentes suffer losses, as do the Svards. The gate nearly falls, but Torthian leads his cavalry in a reckless sortie outside the walls, buying the defenders time to reinforce. Between this and the ballista fire, the assault fails. Terbionsen's men withdraw, and it's only the aftermath that word filters through to Steelshod. Brother Torthian went toe-to-toe with Olaf One-Eye, and the wily old Svard dismounted him, smashed him into submission, and apparently dragged him off alive. Back at the Svardic camp, torturing Torthian into submission on the defenses is largely ineffective, but Cyril is tasked with the job, so he goes through the motions for a little while. Cyril does make a note of getting as much info on the names of the defenders as he can, Steelshod members, Serpentes, anyone Torthian can think of. It may be useful down the road. Eventually, he just leaves Torthian tied to a chair in his tent. Come nightfall, however, Unferth and Cyril are called to meet with the Jarl and his war leaders. Unferth has healed of his wounds, and Terbionsen elects to give him a new task. He wants to cut out the heart of the dock's defenses, so he tells Unferth and his men to get ready for a night raid of their own. Their mission is simple. Sneak into the docks, kill as many as they can, capture any Steelshod they can get their hands on, and bring them back there. Unferth gives an empty, dead smile. This sounds like fun. Thank you for tuning in to Steelshod, a series by Mostly Rights, narrated by Tailforge. You can find every chapter in text format, as well as character sheets, setting information, maps, and rule documents on the Steelshod tabletop system in the link below. If you'd like to support the channel, you can pop down to the description and use the Patreon link for recurring donations, the PayPal.me link for one-time donations, the Teespring link for shirts with the incredibly cool background art by Nobody, or use the DriveThruRPG affiliate link the next time you're looking to try a new system. If you'd like to support the author, you can find Steelshod merch on the mostlyrights.com store, or donate to the Mostly Rights Patreon, which are both linked on reddit.com/r/mostlyrights down below.